In discussions amongst Christians in regard to what is known as eschatology, or the study of future events, what we call prophecy, and in particular with regard to the event known as the rapture of the church, that time when the Lord Jesus Christ will return to the earth to take believers to be with him, Matthew chapter 24 is one of the most important passages in contention. Now, there are a number of different views of Matthew 24, a number of different theological schools, and I'm not going to go into all of them. I'm going to concentrate on two of them, the pre-tribulationist view and the post-tribulationist view. Now, if you're watching a video of this type, then you're probably already at least somewhat familiar with prophecy, unless you're a new believer or you've avoided prophecy up until this point because it can be so contentious and complex, or maybe you stopped by to watch something like this because you're questioning things you've been told. Maybe you've had a discussion with somebody, or maybe you're just reading the scriptures and you're wondering about some things and thinking, is what my pastor is teaching me or what I heard in school, is this really correct? In any event, welcome, and I hope you get something from this presentation. And like I said, I'm going to concentrate primarily on the pre-tribulationist and post-tribulationist schools. Now, I am a post-tribulationist, and I'm going to be examining some of the things that pre-tribulationists say about this passage and why I have some issues with those and why I believe their interpretations are wrong and at least inconsistent. So going into that, I'll go ahead and just do a brief summary of each viewpoint. The pre-tribulationist school of eschatology teaches that at some point in the future, Jesus will show up in the rapture event. He will come to this world, but he will not come all the way. He will only come down into the clouds. He will not be seen by the world at large, but only by Christians. There will not be any immediate signs prior to this event. Nothing special is going to happen to let you know that it's taking place. It's going to be a thief in the night event, to borrow a phrase from Scripture. Come like a thief in the night, snatch believers literally off the planet and take them to be with him in heaven for a period of 7 years. And during that time, believers will supposedly be receiving rewards and engaging in a time of celebration with the Lord. In the meantime, on earth, a satanic figure is going to arise called the Antichrist. He will establish a satanic kingdom, ruling more or less as a viceroy for Satan. And he will violently persecute anyone who opposes him, including those who become believers during that time. At the end of the 7 years, according to pre-tribulationists again, Jesus will then return. He will bring the church with him. He will destroy Antichrist. He will set up a 1,000-year reign, which we call the millennial kingdom. Now, that's the pre-tribulationist view in a nutshell. The post-tribulationist view, to which I subscribe, views some things similarly, but also has some dramatic differences. We do not believe that the rapture and the second coming are separated by 7 years. We believe that they happen in conjunction, that there are a number of things that happen when Jesus returns in the second coming to destroy the Antichrist and to set up his kingdom, and the rapture is one of those events. It's probably amongst the first things that happen when the Lord returns. He gathers Christians into the clouds to be with him for the purpose of getting them together all in one group, raising the dead, as certain passages talk about. The resurrection of the dead will take place at that time. And then he proceeds to Jerusalem with them and establishes his kingdom with them. So they more or less rise up into the clouds to greet the Lord and then accompany him or escort him to the earth along with the angels that will come with the Lord at that time. So some similarities, but some very strong differences as well. And first of all, the first thing I want to point out here is that, again, pre-tribulationists insist that the rapture and the second coming are entirely different events separated by a period of 7 years. And they will show various portions of Scripture, various passages, verses that they think are rapture passages, and others that, by contrast, are second coming passages. And but again, they draw that distinction. They're two separate events. They view Matthew chapter 24 as a second coming passage, whereas a post-tribulationist like myself would see it as both, the rapture happening in conjunction with the second coming. But we would agree, yes, it is a second coming passage, but we just believe that the rapture happens at that same time. And that's easy enough to establish from the context. You can get that from Matthew chapter 24, verse 29. Jesus refers to his coming there. It's the only reference to a coming in this entire chapter. And Jesus says in regard to it, but immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Now, it is in relation to this event that Jesus says a couple of verses later, in verse 36, but of that day and hour no one knows. The day and hour he is referring to is his post-tribulation coming in glory. Again, he says after the tribulation of those days. This is the only coming mentioned in Matthew 24. He does not talk about any other coming. And this is definitely agreed upon by both pre-tribulationists and post-tribulationists as a second coming passage. They view that terminology a little differently here, but they both agree on that. Now, what I want to point out about this, however, is that pre-tribulationists are inconsistent in their use of this passage. They will say that it's definitely a second coming passage, but you will often hear them rebuke anybody who wants to talk about maybe setting a date. Somebody figures or thinks they've figured out when the rapture is going to happen. Pre-tribulationists will come back at them with, no one knows the day or the hour. Now, this happened when a few years ago, Harold Camping of Family Radio infamously began a media campaign to promote his view that he had mathematically worked out the time of the rapture and the final judgment. And his people were going around the country promoting this and spent a lot of money on it. And, of course, it didn't happen. Camping adjusted his date, thought that he figured out whatever it was he got wrong in the first place. But then the second date came and went as well. Still no rapture, still no judgment. I believe Camping actually even issued a third date of some kind for the final judgment. Maybe he figured there wasn't going to be a rapture. I can't remember what it was now. But all of it blew up in his face, blew up in Family Radio's face. It was a bad thing for a lot of them. They had people who had given away everything, and it was a real mess. Camping himself went into seclusion after that whole incident and actually died not long after. He was an old man. He was in his 90s at the time, but I imagine that, in spite of his advanced age, that the humiliation and the stress that came on him after that, that failed prophecy probably really finished him off there. It's a sad thing, but he did bring it on himself. Anyway, the point I'm making about this is an example of a time when the media turned to various leaders and prophecy experts in the Christian community for a comment on what Camping was saying, and the response was almost universally a reference to Matthew 24:36, no one knows the day or the hour. Now, when pre-tribulationists use this, they're stepping, again, outside of the parameters they've set for themselves. They've declared that the rapture and the second coming are two definitely distinct events separated by 7 years, so they can't be the same thing by any way, shape, or form. And this Matthew 24 is definitely a second coming passage, not a rapture passage. Therefore, they should not be using Matthew 24:36 in regard to the rapture. That's just an inconsistency that I've noticed that I wanted to point out there. Pre-tribulationists need to take note of that and re-examine their use of Matthew 24:36 in defending their beliefs about the Lord's return. All right, second point that I want to go into here has to do with pre-tribulationists arguing that post-tribulationists contradict Jesus in what he says about no man being able to know the day or the hour of his return. And the reason that they make this argument has to do with what is called dispensationalism. Now, this can get really murky, and I'm not going to go into it to any great depth. I'm just going to skim over it, but just try to give you an idea of the basic layout. Dispensationalists believe that God deals with people in dedicated time periods in dedicated ways. That's part of it. There's more to it, but that's part of it. And they believe in particular, and pre-tribulationists are, as far as I know, almost all of them are dispensationalists. They believe that God has set aside a certain time period that he's going to work almost exclusively with Israel, that the church and Israel don't really have anything to do much with each other, and that God is going to take the church out of the world so that he can focus on Israel. It's one of the reasons for the rapture. And they base their belief in Daniel chapter 9. Now, Daniel, the Old Testament prophet, received a revelation from an angel that God had ordained 70 weeks to deal with Daniel's people, with the Jewish people, and also this time period would concern the fate of Jerusalem. Now, the 70 weeks are not weeks as we typically think of them, being periods of 7 days. They are instead symbolic of periods of 7 years. So a week in the 70 weeks prophecy is actually a period of 7 years, and there are 70 of these. The area in contention is the last of the weeks, the 70th week of Daniel, the last 7 years of this age of history. Now, there are some people who will argue that the entire 7 years is not future, that there's only 3.5, that Jesus actually himself fulfilled the first 3.5 years of that, so only 3.5 are left. They raise some interesting points. I lean toward there being a full 7 years left for various reasons that are beyond the scope of this video, but I wanted to at least mention that I am aware of that, because some people are likely to comment that that's the case. Yes, I am aware of that. But we're just going right now with the typical dispensationalist model and what most pre-tribulationists and post-tribulationists believe, that there will be a full 7 years left at the end of the age. Now, Daniel 9:27 discusses this and says that in the midst of that week, in the middle part of that week of 7 years, an event will take place called the Abomination of Desolation. Now, we're not entirely sure what that is. We have a few little hints there. If you do a word study on this sometime using some interlinears, there's some interesting stuff there. I'd encourage you to do that. Is really as fascinating what you come up with, and oddly enough, what you don't see, and contrast it to the way certain prophecy teachers talk about it. Many people think they've got it completely figured out. After I did a word study on the passage, I really began to wonder about how much of the traditional interpretation is true. The abomination, the word there, actually in the original language, refers to a shocking or unlawful act of some type. Desolation in Daniel typically refers to war. So you've got some kind of a shocking, unlawful act that brings about a war that leads to desolation as the result of war. That's the impression that I get from the word study that I did on it. But don't mean to digress on that. I just pointed out as an item of interest for those of you who might want to follow up on that. But you've got the 7 year period, midst of the 7 years, middle part, 3.5 years into it. You have the Abomination of Desolation, and then that would leave you with 3.5 years in the 7-year time frame. So 1 7-year period divided in half, 3.5 years on each side. 3.5 is half of 7. Jesus references the Abomination of Desolation in Matthew chapter 24. And he makes a particular note of it there as being the beginning of what is called the Great Tribulation. He does this in verse 15. The first 14 verses of the chapter, he's talked about what is called the beginning of sorrows, or the beginning of birth pangs, where he talks about the wars and rumors of wars, famines, earthquakes, pestilences, and then finally the persecution of believers. In verse 15, he goes on to say, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place," let the reader understand. That's just a parenthetical remark. If you want to understand this, you need to go understand Daniel first. "Then let those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains." He gives a few other instructions, and then he makes the remark that, "For then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will." Now, this reference here has caused some people to divide the 70th week into tribulation and great tribulation. You have the first 3.5 years being the tribulation, and the last 3.5 years being great tribulation. Although most pre-tribulationists actually call the entire 7-year period, the whole 70th week, the tribulation period. Now, I do not do that. I don't believe that's a scriptural way of referring to it, for the simple reason that Jesus only used the tribulation term for the time period after the Abomination of Desolation. He said great tribulation. So in reference to this, when talking about the whole 70th week, I usually just call it that, the 70th week of Daniel. The last 3.5 years typically referred to as the Great Tribulation. I don't talk about a tribulation period just because it's not consistent with the usage in Matthew 24 where these terms come from, and in Daniel 9 as well. But that's not a huge point by any means. It's just something that I point out for people who might be interested. Anyway, the reason that pre-tribulationists say that post-tribulationists contradict Jesus has to do with the timing of this event, the Abomination of Desolation. Remember, you've got 7 years. The abomination occurs in the middle. That leaves 3.5. Post-tribulationists believe that Jesus comes after the tribulation. So after that final 3.5 years. So if you know when the abomination occurs, you know you've only got 3.5 years until Jesus returns. And that, according to Matthew 24, verse 36, is not possible. No one knows the day or the hour. Now that's the argument as it's typically articulated. You can't know the day or the hour, and yet, if you post-tribulationists are correct, we would be able to know the day and the hour simply by observing when the Abomination of Desolation takes place. All right, now, this argument does not hold water for a couple of reasons. First of all, you'll notice in Matthew 24:36, Jesus says, "No one knows." That's present tense. No one knows the day or the hour. Jesus himself did not even know the time when he was coming back at that point when he gave this teaching to his disciples on the Mount of Olives. Now, I believe he knows it now, but he did not know it then. And he said that no one was able to know it. Well, there's a very simple reason for that. Why? Because the Abomination of Desolation hasn't taken place yet. When that event happens, you'll have 3.5 years until the end of the Great Tribulation. And that's the other thing that I want to point out here. Pre-tribulationists are not accurate when they say once the abomination takes place, you have 3.5 years until the return of Jesus. No, you have 3.5 years until the end of the tribulation. The second coming and the rapture that accompany it take place sometime after that, but we don't know how long. There is a gap there after the tribulation. Notice what Jesus said again in Matthew 24, verse 29, "But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky." Then the tribes of the earth will mourn. They'll see him coming with power and great glory, and then he will send forth his angels with the trumpet sound to gather the elect. So you've got the end of the Great Tribulation here. Jesus says after the tribulation, after the Great Tribulation ends, you have certain cosmic signs that take place. And then after that, you have the sign of his own appearing that take place. And then he sends his angels out to gather believers. So you've got a short gap, and I imagine it is probably a very short gap, a matter of a couple of days probably, between the time when the Great Tribulation ends and when the rapture takes place and the second coming happens. So, no, it is not accurate to say that if you know when the Abomination of Desolation happens, you know when Jesus comes. You can only know when the Great Tribulation is going to end. Jesus comes some indefinite amount of time after that. Now, if you want to look, it's interesting to know that there are a couple of parallel passages that also help illustrate this. One of them is Joel chapter 2, verse 30 and 31. I will display wonders in the sky and on the earth, blood, fire, and columns of smoke. The sun will be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. That's interesting there because it's saying that these signs will be displayed before the day of the Lord. And Jesus says they come after the Great Tribulation. So again, you can see a little bit of that gap reflected there. And then you see these cosmic signs again reflected in Revelation chapter 6 at the breaking of the sixth seal. Starting in verse 12, John tells us, I looked when he broke the sixth seal, and there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth made of hair, and the whole moon became like blood. And the stars of the sky fell to the earth as a fig tree casts its unripe figs when shaken by a great wind. The sky was split apart like a scroll when it is rolled up, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. Then the kings of the earth, and the great men, and the commanders, and the rich, and the strong, and every slave and free man hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. And they said to the mountains and to the rocks, fall on us, and hide us from the presence of him who sits on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand? So you've got language there very reminiscent of Matthew 24, 29 to 31, and Joel chapter 2, verses 30 to 31. That emphasizes when the cosmic signs take place, after the tribulation, and immediately preceding the day of the Lord, the period of great judgment, which is prophesied in the Old Testament and also spoken of in the New Testament a number of times. Now, some people might say, no, you're just making this up. Well, first of all, you can see from the text itself that there's a time period there when Jesus says you've got the signs, the cosmic signs, and he says, and then this will take place, and then something else happens. So you've got a progression of events there. That's not hearsay. That's not my opinion. That is plainly what Jesus said. Also, however, if you go to Matthew 25, which is part of the Olivet Discourse, it's unfortunate that there's a chapter division there. Matthew 24 and 25 are the same discourse, and they should be read as one discourse. You go into Matthew 25, you have one of Jesus' most famous parables. It's the parable of the 10 virgins. And he starts off saying, then the kingdom of heaven will be comparable to 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. And he talks about 5 being wise, 5 being foolish. And go down to verse 5. Now, while the bridegroom was delaying, they all got drowsy and began to sleep. But at midnight there was a shout, behold, the bridegroom, come out to meet him. Now, this is interesting. And this ties into the gap that I'm talking about after the tribulation and before the coming of the Lord in the rapture. Notice that the virgins knew when the bridegroom was coming. They knew approximately when he was coming, but they did not know the exact time. They got their lamps ready. They went out to meet him, but there was a time. There was a time delay. Verse 5 says, now while the bridegroom was delaying. So there was a delay. They go out to meet him. They know he should be showing up approximately now, but he doesn't come immediately. They have time to get drowsy and go to sleep, and then they're all woken when he suddenly comes. So there you have a gap in time illustrated for us. The time the virgins go out to meet him, knowing the approximate time versus the exact time of his coming. There's a space in there, just like there is in verses 29 to 31 of Matthew 24. So, no, it's not something I'm making up at all. That's absolutely discernible from the scriptures themselves. You can read that right from them. And I hope I've been able to illustrate that for you. If you have any questions about that, please let me know in the comments. So, post-tribulationists do not contradict Jesus when he said that no one, present tense, knows the day or the hour of his coming. The crucial event, the Abomination of Desolation, has not taken place yet. And even when it does take place, we will still not know the exact day or the hour of his coming, because all that's going to tell us is that we have 3.5 years until the Great Tribulation ends. There's a short period of time following that before the Lord himself actually appears and before he gathers his saints. So there's nothing there that contradicts what Jesus said. He never said that at some point in the future we wouldn't be able to know the approximate time. And again, the parable of the 10 virgins illustrates that for us. They knew the approximate time to go out to meet the bridegroom, but they didn't know exactly when he would show up, and the same is going to be true for us at the end of the age. None of this does any harm whatsoever to the post-trib position. So that's it for this first video on Matthew 24 and the Rapture. I hope it's been of help to you. If you have any questions or any kind of comments on it, anything I might be able to clarify or need to respond to, please leave that in the comments section. I'll take a look and may be able to address those in future videos. I do plan to do at least one more on Matthew 24 and the Rapture. I'm going to take a look at a few arguments that pre-tribulationists make regarding who Matthew 24 is written to. You know, who is the audience here? Is it the church or is it somebody else? And also I'm going to be taking a look at the identity of the elect that Jesus gathers. As he says in verses 29 to 31, when he appears visibly to set up his kingdom, he says he's going to send his angels out to gather his elect. Now, pre-tribulationists maintain that that is not the church, but it's another group. So we're going to take a look at that. And I hope that will also be of help to you. Again, I do represent the post-tribulationist viewpoint. But I thank you for watching. God bless you, and we'll see you hopefully next time.